Hello and welcome to Stellar Strategy Gaming. Today we will be talking about Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and why it is bad for D&D. Tasha's Cauldron of Everything is one of the many content books for D&D which adds extra rules, extra classes, and so on and so forth. Among the ranks of the extra content books are also Xanathar's Guide to Everything, Mordekainen's Guide, and so many more. Today I would like to simply talk about why I think that it probably isn't the best for D&D as a whole. Now, I'm not saying that Tasha's Cauldron of Everything isn't a bad book. It's definitely one of the higher quality content editions, but there are some issues with it.
Yes. For me, the meat of it is that I feel like it's time to just release 6th edition. I do like some of the abilities in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Some of the updates are great, particularly the Beastmaster Rangers improvements are wonderful, and even some of the abilities like the optional steady aim feature for the rogue are great. The problem though is that we have so much sort of additional source material to the player's guide, and we're asking our players and our DMs to know so much about all of these different books and all of these different options and what's an option and what's mandatory, and on and on. You're basically creating an excessive amount of homework for something that's already a pretty work-intensive game.
Yes, and also it's not practical to have 10 extra content books. I mean, we are a D&D channel, yes, but we don't play D&D all that often, largely due to the state of the world right now, and yet at least once a week, we find ourselves spending 10 or 20 minutes looking for a book, and this isn't just our own misplacement of the book. It is simply the more of something you have, the harder it is to keep track of it. It's, from a literal perspective, it isn't practical as well as to the players and the DM.
Yes, and it's not just a question of not being able to find the books, because even if you've got them in PDF, it's the kind of thing where it's, when we were doing our video about the Verdan and the Changelings, it was like, okay, which of the many books we have are those things in? It creates all of this, as I say, extra sort of homework, extra complication. Now, many DMs and players do the optional rule where you have to limit it to 2 source books, so you can't have spells from Xanathar's and a background from Tasha's and a playable race from Acquisitions Incorporated and so on. And I do understand that somewhat mitigates the problem, but there are a couple of problems even with that. One of them is that it's taking away from the game. It might be fun to include things from 3 or 4 different books, and the content is all there. In addition, you're not really lightening the load on the DM very much, because if you have 4 players and each of them is choosing 2 books, that's still potentially all of the books wind up getting used to one degree or another. So really, I think it's getting to be time to sort of find a way to consolidate all of this down. And as I say, just go ahead on into 6th edition. That's the other elephant in the room, is that 6th edition is coming. And is it going to be something like when they went from 4th to 5th, where they change everything? How much of what we have is going to become redundant or obsolete? Because I'm going to be honest with you, I'm going to be kind of upset if we spend all these hundreds of dollars on books in order to have something that only has a certain shelf life and will no longer be as relevant. Also, it's worth mentioning, we've referenced Stibble's Codex of Companions. The fact that outside producers are filling in gaps that even the best books aren't doesn't say anything great about what Wizards is doing. I feel like that's an indication that Wizards isn't just using these to fix problems in the game. I feel like they're using this to milk it a little bit.
Yes, and I would also say that a good solution to the issue of what books to use and such would be to give the current content books a bit of a rating system. It's at least my idea, where a good example of this going very well is in the popular grand strategy game Stellaris. When you are choosing the origin or background for your empire, it actually says beginner start, advanced start, hard start for things like prosperous unification versus your planet blows up in 45 years. It's an important little detail that helps players not get into something they don't want to do, whereas with the current content books there is none of that. And Xanathar's is very easy to read and is pretty good for new players because while it adds a lot of content, it's also very consolidated and it sort of specializes on the classes and somewhat on flavor. Whereas Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, it's literally everything. It has feats, it has more class options for everything, I believe. I think it even has a few species and stuff in there and some spells. So Xanathar's, you put a beginner level on that, because then someone knows, okay, I'm just getting into D&D, but I want to do something a little outside the player's handbook, so I'll grab Xanathar's. Whereas Tasha's Cauldron of Everything, maybe if I, for example, who have played for years now, wanted to do something really crazy, I could grab some feats from Tasha's because it's expert level.
Now, back in the day, there was actually a book called Advanced Dungeons and Dragons that was specifically for players who were a little more advanced. So it's not like we're reinventing the wheel here. I think that what Mara is describing could work. I do feel like, though, it really is time for just some kind of consolidation, because I don't know that breaking the game down, breaking material that's already published and out there, breaking it down into advanced and beginner, etc., is a good solution. I think it's the kind of thing where, again, go into 6e and then do the breakdown from that way. But what are your thoughts on that, Mara?
Well, there's a few things here, one of which is going back to an earlier point you made about redundancy with the books. That's already happened, unfortunately, in 5e. You can find the changeling in Tasha's Cauldron of Everything and Eberron's Guide, and there are many things like that across the books. I believe Goblin is in 2 books, as is a certain type of warlock who I am unfortunately forgetting. Undying, that's it. So that's already happened, which isn't great. But I think the solution doesn't necessarily have to be an early release of 6th E, because I definitely want them to spend as much time getting that correct as possible, given the errors in 5e, and we never want another 4th E. So my solution would be take 5 or 6 of the content books and the player's guide and consolidate it into one, because realistically, we're not going to buy the next book of whatever it adds just because we've already spent hundreds of dollars on it. And on top of that, with the redundancy, it's slowly paying off less and less and less. Whereas, if they released a massive book with all of the best from each of the content books, as well as the base rules, I would be willing to pay $100 for something like that. And especially if it does things like incorporates the new Beastmaster Ranger from Tasha's Guide as a solid. As well, it's not perfect, it's certainly much better than the Player's Guide Beastmaster.
I could definitely see that working, and it's so easy to do online polls and player surveys and things like that. It would be very easy for Wizards to actually find out what people want and what abilities people want their races, their classes, their feats, and their backgrounds to have. So that certainly makes sense to where you could, for example, I wouldn't particularly be interested in a consolidated book that includes the Shifter, because I will never, ever play that player race. But it would be nice to have, for example, Verdan and Tieflings and all the Warlock subclasses incorporated together.
Yeah, and honestly, that's the other thing that's getting at me here a bit is, and this will probably be my final thoughts, but there's also just too much content, not just in the sense of redundancies and things like that, but on top of all of these books and on top of the individual creations that fill the gaps and all of that, we're also having Unearthed Arcana and stuff, and yet we still get the Shifters in a primary book. What is the point of having Unearthed Arcana, which is literally meant to be playtest material, when you're going to incorporate something so bad as the Shifters into a book which costs $50? That doesn't make me want to pay $50 for a new book.
Well, that's a question we've been asking since the original Beastmaster Ranger, so it's probably one for the ages, honestly. Thank you so much for watching. If you've made it this far, as always, please please subscribe. We're trying to up our subscriber count like everybody else on YouTube. Next up, we're going to be doing a little bit of a hot take on the Sorcerer class. It's the one we always forget, and we're going to be talking about the problems with Sorcerers and maybe some ways to rehabilitate it for either 6th E or the 100th Source Material book in 5e. We'll see you on that one.